All right, we're going to be moving on from two-dimensional shapes like all of our polygons and circles, and now move into the realm of three-dimensional figures. So now we're going to add some kind of height or depth to create basically a solid. So we have some vocabulary we want to talk about first. First off, we have a specific type of solid called a prism. So what is a prism? A prism is formed by two parallel congruent polygonal faces. So you'll see that there should be two parallel faces. Faces are basically any of those two-dimensional shapes like triangles, squares, parallelograms that you'll see around a solid. So in this example here on the right, the bases are these triangles. And you can see they are parallel and they are congruent. Congruent is key here. That's kind of how we identify what the congruent bases are. They have to be parallel, or what the bases are, they have to be parallel, they have to be congruent. And then there are additional faces that connect these bases, and they're all going to be in shapes of parallelograms. And remember, that could also be rectangles because rectangles are special parallelograms. One thing you want to know, bases are actually faces, but bases are special faces. So if you imagine like a Venn diagram in the whole world of faces, bases are a subset of them. So when we talk about a face, a base is included in it, but a base is a special face. So if we have a base, we want to call it a base because that's the best label for it. Just like you wouldn't call a square a parallelogram necessarily, the better label for that would be a square. Okay, so that's a prism. A cylinder is basically the same thing as a prism, but instead of having a polygon as a base, we have circles. So that's why we have a different kind of shape here. So a cylinder is formed by two parallel congruent circular bases. And that's really the only difference, is now our bases don't have any edges or straight edges, right? Our bases are now circles. So then when we're looking at the faces of, or the face of your cylinder, you're like, wait a minute, there's no like parallelogram or anything. It's this curved, smooth piece that goes around your cylinder. So this is a curved surface. So there's really no kind of name for it, right? We just want to recognize that it is smooth and it's a curve all the way around. Okay. So a cylinder, what's unique about that is it actually has no straight edges. There are only curved edges. So in your problems when you're working, if it asks you to name an edge, we're actually asked for straight edges. So a cylinder would actually have no edges. So that's kind of interesting. It has no edges, it has no vertices. Just to remind you guys again, those vocabulary words, let me just jump back up to the prism for a moment. Right, all of these points on the polygons, these are vertices or vertex. That's a point. And then you have an edge, right, that connects vertex to another vertex. These are edges. So when you're naming these things, you're naming a segment for an edge, a point for vertex, a plane for all faces and bases. Okay. Next up, we have a pyramid. So a pyramid is basically kind of like a prism, but instead of having two bases, there's only one. So there's a single polygon base. And again, this polygonal base has to be a triangle, a square, a hexagon, a heptagon, whatever. But there's one of those bases. And then all of the lateral faces, these triangular faces now that come upwards, meet at one specific point, this vertex. So these in orange are your faces. Okay. Finally, we have a cone, which is very similar to kind of like the situation we had with the cylinder. It's basically like a pyramid, but we smoothed it all out. There are no straight edges anymore because now instead of having a polygon as our base, we have a circle as our base. And that's really the only difference, right? And then this curved surface that leads upwards ends at a specific point, that vertex. So we don't really have any straight edges here either. Oops, I was gonna write curved surface and I was about to write vertex. So this is your curved surface. Okay, so what's cool about the cone is it does have a single vertex, but it has no straight edges at all and a single circle as its base. So how do we name these shapes? We name them looking at the shape of the base. So if you see that first row there in blue, those are all of our prisms. You do want to say if it's a prism versus a pyramid. What's nice about the cone and the cylinders, they're always cones and cylinders. There's no different types. It's just either a cone or a cylinder. But because the polygon bases can change, we want to name each prism and pyramid based on the base. So if you look at this very first blue one, we can see our parallel congruent shapes are triangles, which is why it's called a triangular prism. I'm going to skip over the rectangular prism for a moment. Let's look at the pentagonal prism. You can see we have two congruent pentagons, and it doesn't matter if your prism is slanted like this, it's still a prism, right? So that's a pentagonal prism. Then we've got a hexagon here, right? And then what else kind of clues you in is what connects the two hexagons. They're all parallelograms or rectangles. So that also tells you, hey, those rectangles or parallelograms aren't going to be our bases. They connect the two hexagons. So those are our bases. Now, do the bases always have to be top bottom? No, you can always rotate and change your view. What matters is you always just have two of those shapes and they're parallel. Okay, coming back to the rectangle, why did I skip it over? Because a rectangular prism, I'm gonna star this. It's special because all 6 faces are rectangles. Which means any pair of opposite faces could be considered a base. So, for example, like I was saying, it doesn't have to be top and bottom. These two that I'm highlighting here, side to side, those could be your bases. Top and bottom could be your bases. Front and back could be your bases. So those opposite congruent rectangles, any of those could be bases. But they're still rectangles, so it's a rectangular prism. And that's a good thing to think about because that's kind of a special case. Related to this, which I didn't draw on here, is a cube, which is also a type of rectangular prism, but all 6 sides are going to be the exact same square. So that's kind of neat. All right, and you can see the same idea for the for the pyramids. Again, I'm going to skip over the triangle for a moment. You'll see the base, and again, it doesn't have to be drawn with the base on the bottom, but that dictates the name of your shape. So a rectangular pyramid has a rectangle as a base, and then you see all these triangles leading up to a point. Right, a pentagonal pyramid, you can see there's 1 pentagon, and then 5 triangles leading up to a specific vertex opposite that base. So the vertex is always opposite the base, right? And there's more than 1 vertex here, but I guess the apex, right? That vertex across from the base, that peak, I guess. Same thing for the hexagonal pyramid. We have a pyramid because we see these triangles leading up to a point, and opposite that point is a hexagon. So why did I skip over triangle, the triangular pyramid? Because it's very similar to the rectangular pyramid. You'll see that all 4 of these faces are triangles. So all faces here are triangles. So that means any of those faces could be a base. So for example, this one here on the left, I can say that's the base. And then all the other faces, all the other triangles lead up to an apex. So that's kind of neat about the triangular pyramid. It's kind of like the rectangular prism where any of those faces could be the bases. All right, so now each of these 3-dimensional solids can be broken down to what we call a net. So you probably have done this before when you might have like cut out a pattern and folded up a dice. It's basically breaking this down into a 2D pattern. So you're imagining we're cutting along the edges and unfolding it. That creates a net. Okay, and we'll look at some of these in just a little bit. And the second thing we want to be able to do with our solids is identify a cross-section. You guys have probably seen cross-sections a lot in other textbooks. So, for example, when you studied the different layers of the surfaces of the Earth, you probably saw a picture where they kind of cut into the Earth and you see the layer that's the crust and everything underneath that I don't remember. Or if you've taken bio, you probably looked at what happens if you cut a cell and you looked inside and we see, oh, I have a cross-section that shows me where the nucleus is and the membranes and the Golgi bodies or whatever, right? So those are cross sections. Luckily for us, we're just cutting, imagine we're cutting wooden blocks and you're just looking at, okay, what do we see when we open that up? You cut it in some way, like top to bottom, side to side, and then you lift it up and you're looking at the inside, what shape do we see? That's basically what we're looking at. So it's basically the intersection of a 3D figure and a plane. Okay, and like I said, we're just basically looking at these as solid blocks, and you're just going to tell me what shape you see once we cut the block. So hopefully it'll be a little more straightforward when we look at some examples. So let's take a look at example 1. We see these are 2 patterns, A and B, and we want to decide, okay, does the pattern is it a net for a cube? So imagine if you had one of these, you cut it out, can you fold it up to make a cube? Does it turn into like a dice? And if so, name the letters of the faces that will appear on opposite sides. So what we can do is we can go ahead and just assign letters to each box, to each face. So I can say this is A, B, C, D, E, F, A, B, C, D, E, F. So I want you guys to take a moment and decide which one, or do they both, or one of them, or neither of them become a cube, and if so, what would become on the what would be on the opposite faces? So you guys are exercising an idea of visualizing, right? Can you fold this up in your head and see what happens? All right, so hopefully you guys noticed that B was totally not possible. So no matter how we cut it up, remember we don't want to cut the boxes completely off. You just want to cut around the outside and fold it. There's no way for it to become a 3D cube. So A was the option that would work, and if you folded it up, you want to see the opposite faces would be A and D, B and E, C and F. Okay, so our last activity is just to come up with your own net. So we want to draw a net for the solid, labeling the net with its dimensions, and then we want to talk about this idea of a horizontal and a vertical cross section. But first, let's go ahead and build a net. So for this shape, let's go ahead and name it. So what do you think you would call this? And oh, there's a mark. Some marks missing, so let's add that mark in. So what do you think you would call this? Oh wait, one last thing that's missing. There we go. If you can't tell, that's a right angle. So what would this be? Square pyramid. And sometimes it's nice to be able to name it, because then that tells you what kind of faces and bases we're dealing with. So there's different ways you can draw this, but the way I like drawing pyramids is I like to draw the base in the center, and then the triangular faces kind of fan out and make this kind of, I guess, flower type of pattern there. And then we want to label the dimensions. So that's important because we want to make sure our sides will match up, right? And we know what the lengths would be. So each of these 4 congruent sides of the square are 8 centimeters. And then each of these slanted edges going down the side of the triangular faces are 10 centimeters. And you don't have to write 10 every time. You can just use these congruent marks. And there's my net. Okay? So to talk about the horizontal and vertical cross section, what I want you to imagine is for our horizontal cross section, you're imagining you have this pyramid, okay, and then you are going to cut it clear across the top. So I'm going to draw this kind of red plane. You can imagine this as like a knife or some kind of chopping block, and you want to cut through that top of your pyramid. And then you're asking yourself, okay, if I take off the top, what shape would I see? And you would hopefully find it's parallel to the base, so that cross section is a square. Okay, when we're doing something in the vertical cross section, what I want you to do is now take that red kind of knife, look at your pyramid. Ooh, and that's a bad drawing. Let me try that again. That's a little better. And now I want you to cut downward, so straight down, top to bottom, right? And then you're imagining, okay, what would that look like where it's being cut? And then you'll see, oh, it's going straight perpendicular to the base, so here it's going to be a triangle. So that's what I mean by horizontal and vertical cross sections. Okay, I'd like you guys to go ahead and try B on your own, and then we'll come back and check your answers. Oh, and also try to name that shape before you begin. All right, so with this one, it might have been a little tricky to think about labeling your dimensions on your net, but hopefully the net itself wasn't too bad. There's, of course, different ways you can draw it. You can move those triangles to any one of those rectangles if you'd like. But you'll want to see that we actually had 2 congruent rectangles that are 10 by 4, and then one different one that's on the bottom of the way the shape is drawn, which is 7 by 4. So we actually have 3 different numbers we have to label, so be careful with that. And then in this case, because of the way the shape is positioned, if we're cutting horizontally, we're not cutting parallel to the base, we're cutting parallel to that bottom rectangle. So the horizontal cross section is a rectangle, and in this case the vertical cross section is a triangle. So do take a look at the orientation of your shape. Okay, so that concludes our introduction to solid shapes. Please let me know if you have any questions. Oh, actually, one last thing I forgot to add. What do we do about nets for cylinders and cones? What's nice about this is they're always going to be kind of the same thing. So the net for a cylinder will always be 2 circles connected by this rectangular piece. So that rectangular piece will wrap around the circumference of the circle to make that smooth curved surface. So our cone's net is very similar, but because we only have 1 circle, you're going to have this kind of triangular piece. And really, it's not necessarily going to be flat. It could be curved, but again, there's going to be this triangular piece that'll create the curved surface and that opposite vertex. So those are the nets we would draw for a cylinder and a cone. And then the important dimensions here would really be the radius and the height of that rectangle. And here it would be basically the radius of the base of the cone, and also that kind of perpendicular height going to this distance right here, going to that opposite vertex. Okay, so now I'm really done. Thanks for listening.